Day 8 of Sean Diddy Combs' federal sex trafficking trial delivered some more explosive testimony. His former executive assistant took the stand, alleging he picked up drugs for Combs, set up hotel rooms with supplies, endured constant threats, and we found out what federal authorities found in Diddy's mansion. We've got all the explosive details from inside the courtroom. We're going to be talking with Law&Crime's reporter Elizabeth Millner to break it all down. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey everybody, this is another Law&Crime legal alert. If you received Depo-Provera birth control shots and were later diagnosed with a brain or spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients weren't properly warned about this risk. It's free to check, takes a few minutes. You don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on screen, click the link below, or head over to forthepeople.com/LCDepo to see if you qualify. The federal sex trafficking trial of Sean Diddy Combs took yet even more explosive turns today. Day 8, as his former executive assistant George Kaplan took the stand, revealing some stunning details about alleged drug pickups, secret hotel room setups, more alleged threats to employees. Meanwhile, prosecutors, they teased a major witness for tomorrow, none other than rapper Kid Cudi. He's had quite the past with Combs' ex-girlfriend Cassandra Ventura, allegations of arson, right? Talking about a blown-up car. But first, Kaplan. So the last witness to take the stand today, his testimony painted a picture of Combs as this demanding boss who allegedly used his assistant to procure drugs, set up hotel rooms with supplies, even repeatedly threatened his job. We're going to get into all that. We're going to get into a lot more. But for this, I'm not going to do it alone. I'm going to bring on right now Law&Crime's reporter Elizabeth Millner, who's been inside that courtroom in the Southern District of New York for every second of the testimony, including for today. Elizabeth, great to see you. So I want to start off with what's perhaps the most shocking claim. You have Diddy's former assistant, this is George Kaplan, former executive assistant. He testified that he actually picked up drugs for Diddy. Can you tell us what exactly he said about that? Because again, this is important for the racketeering charge. If we're talking about Combs operating a criminal enterprise and he was using his assistants and his bodyguards to further criminal activity or provide supplies for criminal activity and cover it up, these are the people you want to hear about. So what exactly did he say about picking up drugs for Diddy?
Well, absolutely, Jesse. And you know what? I'm just going to kind of tell you and take it a little bit back just 2 hours earlier, just because outside of the presence of the jury, so right while Dr. Hughes was testifying, they were dismissed for lunch. Then we had this moment again outside of the presence of the jury where we were first introduced to George Kaplan, us in the gallery, us in the press. Obviously, the prosecution and both the defense were, we see George Kaplan taking the stand and we're like, okay, what's about to happen? Well, let me just tell you, Jesse, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right of self-incrimination outside of the presence of the jury, and in exchange for that, he was actually given a court-ordered immunity deal, which is why maybe he's being so forthcoming about just all the everything that he had to do as far as responsibility goes while he was on the job and under the employment of Diddy for that 2-year time period. And so whenever he got on the stand again, George Kaplan, for the most part, he is kind of medium built, a little stocky. And when I had noticed him taking the stand outside of the presence of the jury, I saw him and Diddy kind of look at each other. George Kaplan smiled at him, Diddy smiled back, and so there seemed like familiarity about him to him. So when he announced himself as a former executive assistant of Diddy and working for the Combs enterprise per se, then I was like, okay, he's another staff member, because sometimes you just never know who these people are and who's going to be testifying in this trial. And so as far as George Kaplan, today he was questioned by Maureen Comey. So he used to actually work at Nickelodeon for about a 7-month period, and then he moved over to the Combs enterprise in December of 2013. So he had worked for Diddy's company, and this was a holding company, that being Combs enterprise, and he said it was essentially a holding company that oversees all of Diddy's other companies, which includes liquor and lifestyle, television, even clothing, and I presume he means the Sean John line. But he worked under this Combs enterprise that he calls it from December of 2013 to December of 2015. So he says initially for a 10-month period, he was actually hired as an executive assistant to the chief operating officer. And that, again, was about a 10-month period. Then afterwards, he his next role at the his next role at the job was an executive assistant to the chairman. Now, who was the chairman? That being none other than Sean Combs himself. And so that promotion happened in September of 2014. He said one of the people that he reported to was Christina Coram, who he calls KK, who Cassie has called KK, and who other staff members who have also testified also refer to her as KK. And so he said that he had, for the most part, worked at Diddy's LA home, and this is the one on 200 Mapleton over in Los Angeles. He said his responsibilities included carrying bags of clothes, medicine, food, computers, iPads. He organized Diddy's home so that way things would be up in top shape for the chairman, and that's who his boss was essentially. He said his responsibilities changed after Diddy pretty much started trusting George a little bit more, and that's when he would be working with Diddy at the studio. He'd be working very long hours into the night sometimes after those studio sessions. He would set up hotel rooms where you can kind of see me leading to where I'm going next. But as far as just his work overall, he said sometimes he would be working 80 to 100 hours per week. Now, mind you, the normal hours for us regular folks is just about 40 hours per week and maybe some overtime here and there. But for George Kaplan, he described pretty much working essentially sometimes 24/7. And so he says the day normally started around 9:30 in the morning, but sometimes they would go as long as 6 or 7 a.m. And he said that, again, some of his responsibilities were just making sure that Diddy had everything ready to use. Those include unpacking the bags, bringing him car chargers ready to go, and grabbing him food. And he said he had other assistants, so it wasn't just George Kaplan working as an assistant. There were 4 other assistants as well too. But as far as just kind of the hotel rooms, and that's kind of where I was leading up to a little bit, his duties included unpacking hotel bags, and those included clothes, those included speakers, they included other things like candles, liquor, baby oil, and even Astroglide. And so as far as who bought the supplies, George said that he did buy these supplies. He used a corporate credit card, and he said he needed a little more than an hour to essentially set up this room. And he was instructed to do so either by Christina Coram or he was instructed to do so by Diddy himself. So he said that he set up hotel rooms in Los Angeles and New York and Miami. He mentioned that he set up a hotel here in Trump Hotel and here in New York City. He set up a hotel room at the Intercontinental Hotel in Los Angeles, a hotel that feels like we're very familiar with at this point, as well as other hotels too. And he said these hotels were booked under the name Frank Black, and he says that was actually in reference to Biggie, who kind of sometimes used the pseudonym of Frank White. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting tidbit over there. But as far as these hotel stays, he said Diddy would stay in these hotels anywhere from 12 hours to days on end, and then afterwards he would clean up everything, and those included cleaning up empty bottles of liquor, empty bottles of water, empty bottles of, you might guessed it, baby oil. He says that he came across a brown crystallized powder in the sink one time. He said he would have to clean up this hotel room afterwards, as opposed to having the hotel staff or the maids clean it up, because it was important to protect Diddy, and his public image was very important for him. He says that he would see hotels essentially selling photos of high-profile guests who would stay at those hotels to newspapers, and then it would be a whole thing of just this information getting out. And so that was kind of his role as far as setting up these hotels. But even as far as just some of the drugs that he procured for Diddy, it was kind of a little of a long list, as far as just kind of, there are times that he would get Molly for Diddy or MDMA for him. But as far as just kind of how those logistics works, Jesse, that I felt like was an interesting point as well too.
Yeah, it's really illuminating, to say the least. And again, trying to tie it to the racketeering charge. He also mentioned something about how in 2015, Diddy apparently hired more security, right? What changed after that?
So it wasn't necessarily clear what the big change was. I think that's where we were kind of leading to, or at least that they were going to circle back on during his direct testimony, which will still continue on into tomorrow. But as far as just his mention of security, he said when he had first started working with Diddy and for Combs Enterprise, that he had worked, that security members included D-Rock, they included Paul, who we know to be Uncle Paulie, and they included Rue, which we know to be a security guard named Ruben. But he said around the time that he was leaving his job position, mentioned that they ended up having licensed security guards around the 2015 timeframe. And so again, they didn't go into more details about why that switch was made, but as far as just how the new security compared to the old security, he essentially said that the new security were more professional, they were more polished, they had more training to them. And I think that was an interesting point that he had made, especially since when we had heard from David James on the witness stand, he had mentioned that some of the security guards would bring over women to Diddy's home and that type of thing. But again, as far as the reason why the switch up of the security happened, we haven't gotten there just yet, but I assume that that'll definitely be asked during testimony tomorrow.
And I understand he also talked about Combs threatening him or allegedly threatening him. What did he say?
Yeah, he said those threats would go on sometimes monthly. He said that Diddy had told them that he only wanted to be surrounded by the best, and that sometimes he would appear angry when he would say something like this, but also that he would appear motivational when saying this type of thing. But as far as even just some of the threats, one of the threats were even made while George Kaplan brought Diddy the wrong water. It was something that Diddy wanted, this alkaline water, and so what George did was he combined half a gallon of alkaline water and another half gallon of alkaline water and then put it together to make that 1 gallon, and Diddy didn't necessarily like that. And so that was another instance that he remembered about Diddy just threatening his job essentially over fancy water.
I want to circle back about the drugs because drugs are important in this case. On one hand, prosecutors say that the drugs were used to keep victims compliant. On the other hand, possession of drugs with intent to distribute is one of the underlying predicate crimes that the prosecution can prove in order to get to the racketeering charge. What did he say about picking up the drugs, purchasing the drugs? How did that all work out?
Yeah, it seems like drugs are kind of like a common theme, especially that the prosecution's trying to lay out that there was just drugs essentially every day in Diddy's life. It seems that's where the prosecution is kind of going with this. But as far as George Kaplan is concerned, he said that he did pick up MDMA for Diddy after being asked to by Diddy himself. He said this instance happened, or this particular incident that he recalled happened in Miami. Diddy asked him to pick up drugs. Diddy gave him the number, I guess, of the respective drug dealer. This person came to Diddy's house who had the drugs with him. He used Diddy's money to pay for these drugs. It was MDMA, and then he would give Diddy the drugs. And he recalled this incident also happening in Los Angeles at the Bel Air Hotel with a different drug dealer that he was instructed to pick up these drugs for Diddy in Hollywood. He wasn't sure what the drug necessarily was, but he said that the money did definitely come from Diddy, and that's where court kind of ended for the day. So I assume they'll kind of pick back up, at least from the drugs, and then go into more and more kind of layers of just, I guess, whatever his testimony is expected to be tomorrow.
Yeah, so definitely an important witness in this case. And the reason I started with him at the end is because it's kind of the newest testimony that we're hearing, but it doesn't disregard what we heard earlier on in the day. Because somebody that I actually dedicated a Sidebar episode to, somebody who I think is going to be critical for this case, is a forensic psychologist who testified about essentially one of the main questions in this case. If Cassandra Ventura claims that she was a victim of Diddy's abuse for years, why didn't she leave? Why did she agree to freak-offs? Why did she seemingly set them up? Why was she encouraging them? Was she really? Was she really? Was it actually a lack of consent? Are we talking about complicated psychological issues? Why? Because we heard the testimony of Dr. Dawn Hughes. So, by the way, she had testified in the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, this board-certified forensic and clinical psychologist. She testified on behalf of Amber Heard back in that 2022 defamation trial. Elizabeth, she took the stand for the prosecution. Important witness to explain Cassandra Ventura's behavior, even though she didn't directly examine her, my understanding is. But she made some key points about why somebody like her would possibly stay in a relationship if it was truly toxic and it was truly abusive, and to basically say to the jury, she is potentially a victim of sex trafficking. What insights do you have about Dr. Dawn Hughes?
Yeah, well, one thing about Dr. Dawn Hughes is when she was on the witness stand. Now, Jesse, I'm someone who talks really, really fast. I know that. My mom has even told me about that. But Dr. Hughes, when she was on the stand, she was probably talking faster than I am talking to you right now. She goes so fast that sometimes I'm just like writing everything down and that stuff. But she goes so fast. And so as far as just some of the key points of her testimony, you know, the question always remains, and it's a question we ourselves get sometimes when we're doing stories outside of this coverage, just about why victims of domestic violence and why victims of sexual abuse stay with the partners. And she really kind of broke it down in a way that I think was maybe very helpful to the jury, but it also came with kind of this giant caveat that she wasn't allowed to say certain words like coercive control, something that was agreed upon even prior to trial beginning. And so as far as just some of the testimony that she gave while under direct, she was talking just about physical abuse, where the normal reaction when somebody hits us or when a victim is hit is just fear, and it's really hard to kind of break that pattern. She talked about psychological abuse, where it's all about threatening physical violence and you're kind of walking on eggshells, and those symptoms included depression and PTSD and anxiety. She talked about sexual abuse and how a lot of people don't necessarily disclose sexual abuse because it's a private harm. It can be hard to kind of talk about these types of things, because even just think about just the reaction to when Cassie Ventura, and again, she never mentioned Cassie by name when she was giving her direct examination. So she didn't name Cassie by name while she was testifying under direct because she was called as a blind witness. So somebody who didn't evaluate Cassie or any of the witnesses in this case. She didn't evaluate Diddy, the defendant in this case. But as far as just the reaction, because when we go back to November of 2023, when Cassie had first filed her lawsuit, just the reaction from it was, why did you stay with him so long? Why did you do all these activities with Diddy? Why did you stay with him knowing that he'd beat you? Just all these questions of why. So Dr. Hughes, again, I think did a great job on kind of breaking it down during the direct testimony, as far as even in instances of emotional abuse, where someone belittles them, demeans them, and puts down their partner. If you can't talk about kind of what's happening with other people just out of fear or anything like that, how can you go and try to get help? Because you might be embarrassed or ashamed just of everything that you're going through, and so it might be hard to talk about these things. She brought up another point where she was discussing just the financial aspect of everything, where she said that sometimes people need tangible reasons to leave. So how do you leave someone if you don't have access to tangible resources such as money or an apartment? When asked as far as why victims do come back to their perpetrators or their abusers, she said it's because more often than not, relationships start out at a place of love, and the person who wants that love back will just continue going back to the person who inflicted possibly violence on them, abuse on them, just because they always are remembering that person that they first fell in love with. She said that they want the good person back, and it creates kind of a trauma bond because these acts just get so humiliating too that they're scared to talk about it out of fear, so they end up going back to their abusers, where essentially this is kind of common. And as far as just the trauma bond, that a lot of people feel hopelessness. They have a fear of just leaving their partner and even just trying to leave. We talk about this all the time at Law&Crime, where it takes more than one time for somebody to try to leave. It takes multiple attempts for people to try to leave because there's so many obstacles, such as fear of retaliation, that their lives could be in danger, and that more often again than not, victims end up returning again to their abusers, to their perpetrators, because they return for that love. They return for that good version of the partner that they fell in love with initially. Something that I feel like kind of directly plays into what Cassie was talking about while on the stand, but it's not even just isolated to Cassie, right? Again, this is something that's very common that we talk about throughout our society, just about believing victims that go through these types of things. And just as far as the question of why, I think Dr. Hughes did a great job on explaining why this is the case.
You know, I think that this case could rise and fall with her testimony. Because, and by the way, I know that the prosecution, the defense is going to call their own expert to counter it, but I think that back and forth with the jury, trying to understand and make sense of Cassandra Ventura's testimony versus her text messages versus her, allegedly staying in this relationship for what the reasons were, may all come down to if they believe Dr. Dawn Hughes, which brings me to my central question here. How was the jury responding to her testimony? And this is before we even get into the cross. So we'll put the cross to the side for a second. How was the jury responding to what she was explaining to them? Were they attentive? Were they taking notes? Did they seem like, I know it's impossible, but did it seem like they were, agreeing with what she was saying?
So as far as the jury's just reaction to all of this testimony, when she was first under direct, her testimony wasn't very long, honestly. I didn't think it lasted that long. So from what I could see of these jurors, they were writing down their notes. There's this one juror who sits in the front row that I'm always kind of focused on because he seems so focused on this case. He's always jotting down notes. He's always looking at the exhibits. And so I'm always kind of wondering what's going on in his mind. And then from just speaking with other people who work in the press and stuff like that, they say they're always focused on row 2 because row 2 is a little bit more animated, but from where I was sitting, unfortunately, I didn't have the best view of them. But from what I could see of just some of the ones on the end, I definitely saw a lot of attention, especially to Dr. Hughes when she was testifying. And there are times where, they do the kind of back and forth between the prosecutor and then the witness. But for the most part, from what I could see, I should say, I definitely saw these jurors just focused on kind of everything at hand. Now, once it got to the cross-examination, they might have been lost a little bit because that just went on and on and on.
well, let's talk about the cross-examination. So 2 things about the cross-examination. The person who was conducting the cross-examination is somebody we haven't seen in this courtroom before. And 2, what was the theme of the cross-examination? What were the points they were trying to hit?
Yeah, well, to go to your first point, Jesse, this was the first time the jury was essentially seeing Jonathan Bach in action. Now, fun fact about Jonathan Bach is that he's actually married to another defense attorney that we know very well here in this trial, and that's Alexandra Shapiro of Shapiro and Bach, or Bach and Shapiro. And so they work together. They are together as a married couple, and now they work on this case together. So I think that's kind of an interesting fun fact. But as far as the cross-examination goes, Jonathan Bach, for the most part, was very meticulous as far as just asking the questions. He really kind of took it piece by piece. I was kind of wondering myself whether or not the jurors were like, who is this guy and why is he showing up on day 8? But he really kind of stole the show when it came to this cross-examination. And there were points where it really just felt like it was just going on, and we were just wondering where was this going, because it felt like the cross was at least 3 times longer than the direct examination. So he was essentially trying to hit home the points that people don't necessarily fit in boxes, because Dr. Dawn Hughes was testifying in general. She wasn't going specifically talking about Cassie Ventura or even the other witnesses in the case. She was really just kind of speaking in general, just about the topics at hand. But she was asked, you can't diagnose someone without hearing what they have to say. And Dr. Hughes responded that that's true. And she kind of was driving home the point herself that she was just giving an opinion, or she wasn't there to give an opinion. She was just there, again, to talk about these certain topics at hand. And Jonathan Bach was going over whether or not she used data for forensic investigations, whether or not she looked at sources of information, whether or not she looked at police reports or medical backgrounds or educational backgrounds or documents and records, even though she's kind of trained to kind of look at this detail. And I could see Diddy during this really just nodding his head, kind of like he's just like watching this all in action and just giving his approval, I should say, of Jonathan Bach. So then in the middle of testimony, we break for a lunch break. Then when we return from lunch, they continue on with the cross-examination. Jonathan Bach is asking, you can't characterize something if you didn't evaluate an individual. And Dr. Hughes kind of explained it is kind of controversial, but it's something that can be done. Then Jonathan Bach brought back that she had testified in a similar case over in Brooklyn, just right across the bridge from here. And she was asked, you would agree that the American Psychological Association says that says to avoid rendering opinion about victims. And Dr. Hughes responded yes. But I thought it was interesting because, when Dr. Hughes was testifying under direct examination, again, she wasn't saying Cassie's by name, but you could tell that this is where the defense was kind of going, where it's like, you didn't evaluate Cassie. How can you talk about just some of the issues that she had gone through if you didn't speak to her directly, or again, you didn't speak to any of the other witnesses in this case? During this time, Diddy is kind of nodding his head a little bit, again, kind of from what I could feel, just giving approval of just how Jonathan Bach was conducting this cross-examination. Hughes says that she didn't read any type of articles or news reports, police reports in relation to this case. She doesn't know about Cassie's drug use or anything of that sort, that she was just there to give subject matter testimony. And then that's when they kind of get a little spicy as far as the cross-examination goes, because the defense was like, well, you didn't talk about who got a civil plaintiff's lawyer. And the defense was essentially saying that some of these people who kind of talk about this abuse, that they just essentially want money. And Dr. Hughes explained, well, they want to right the wrongs. I think that's something that Cassie herself has kind of been wanting to do. But the judge kind of snapped at that moment and said, move on. Then the defense kind of continued asking just about victims going to civil lawyers and recalling details that they never recalled before. Then there was a whole sidebar, not sidebar presented by Jesse Weber, but a sidebar where both parties, both parties go off to the side. But let me tell you guys something. When we have sidebars in court, it's this really loud, static noise that we're hearing that's just like, and it goes on and on and on, essentially until both parties and the judge are back in their respective spots. So it's not a situation like you may see in Law and Order where they all go up to the judge's bench, they whisper to each other, anything like that. It's really like in a huddle with both parties, the judge, the court reporter off to the side while this loud noise kind of goes on. So then they actually ended up dismissing the jury because they had to have some quick arguments about something that the defense wanted to introduce, and that was just kind of this presentation that Dr. Hughes did back in 2015, where she was conducting kind of a webinar essentially about, it was involving women who have been battered, and for an organization, again, this being 10 years ago in 2015. So I thought it was interesting that the defense pulled essentially this presentation that she did from 10 years ago, where essentially Dr. Hughes was talking about giving expert witness testimony in cases that involved domestic violence. There were all these different parts about appearing in court or having certain conduct on the stand, navigating direct and cross-examination. And initially, the government had an objection to this because they didn't want this document shown in front of the jury. They didn't want it shown in front of the jury because they said that this could get a little confusing for them. And so what they ended up doing was not showing it in front of the jury, just showing it to the respective parties as well as the witness herself, that being Dr. Hughes. And so they were just going on and on and on. It lasted a little bit for, I would say, felt like more than 2 hours, honestly, to the point I was like, oh my goodness, when will this end? But the defense kind of was bringing it back as far as just how much money that she was making, giving her testimony, and whether or not she evaluated men who've been accused of sex crimes. And she says, I don't evaluate offenders. She was asked how many times she met with prosecutors, around 6 times or so. And she said, I don't know, I have to check my logs. Well, you had a meeting all those times with the prosecutor, but you didn't learn any of the facts of the case. And she responded, that's correct. And so I think they were trying to be like, well, why are you meeting with the prosecution so much? But then again, the jury doesn't know this, but there were so many kind of stipulations when it came to what she could talk about, what she couldn't talk about, and even just the guidelines in between that. Because I will say the direct testimony was very short, in part because, one, there was a lot of objections from the defense, something that they said they wouldn't do, but I think they were getting into that blurry-ish area of just kind of crossing that line of where they weren't supposed to talk about. And so it was a long cross-examination, Jesse, and so I think they might have just lost the jury with that, but from Diddy's standpoint, I think he kind of approved on just how much of a shark Jonathan Bach definitely appeared while under that cross, or while he was giving the cross-examination.
Well, it's clear. They're basically saying she's a hired gun, that her opinions are unreliable, they're not even useful or applicable to the situation at hand because she didn't evaluate Cassie. She's making these generalizations. I'm assuming that's the kind of argument they'll make in a closing argument. But that wasn't even the most salacious aspect about what happened today. I got to tell you, so we do the lunchtime show, right? We do a lunchtime show every day on Law&Crime's YouTube. You come out, you give us an update about what happened in the morning. We take viewers' questions. I cannot tell you how many questions we have been getting, and by the way, I've been getting in person, about when is it going to come out what they found at Diddy's homes during the raids? What did they find inside of Diddy's Miami Beach home when it was raided in March of 2024? That was a big, big development in this legal saga. So I understand a special agent from Homeland Security took the stand, right? Continued the testimony. What exactly was found inside of Combs' house in Miami when they conducted the raids?
Well, Jesse, it was a lot. It was so much stuff to the point, I don't know if you guys can see my notebook here, but it's like a laundry list of items, plus it goes on to the next page, plus it goes on to the next page of just all the exhibits we saw of what was found in Diddy's Miami home. So this particular witness that you were talking about was Special Agent Jared Gannon. Now he works for Homeland Security Investigations over in Miami. He's a part of the National Security Group, and he was actually a part of around this time frame, this being March 25th of 2024, he was part of the Miami Human Trafficking Group, and he was responsible for investigating labor and sex trafficking. So he was the one who kind of helped conduct the search on Diddy's home on Star Island, this giant mansion over in Miami. That Star Island is essentially a place where, as you guessed it, all the stars live, because those houses are just enormous. But as far as just all the items seized, it was a lot of items. I just can't stress that enough. Homeland Security seized high heels, 7-inch high heels. They also seized some sex items in the primary bedroom closet. We saw a close-up of the red heels. We saw a close-up of the sex toys, and they even displayed the red high heels in front of the jury today. So Special Agent Gannon just showed them to the jury. He put them back in the evidence bag, and then they kind of went on with more exhibits. But he said more than a dozen high heels were seized from Diddy's property during this raid. We were also shown an exhibit photo of shoes and Balenciaga boots, which are very expensive boots, by the way, that were shown in the primary closet. Now, why are these Balenciaga boots such a big deal? Well, it's because inside the Balenciaga boots were 3 cell phones that were seized. They didn't get into too much detail as far as why these particular phones and the importance of these phones, but you kind of have to think that maybe they belong to the defendant himself. But as far as just everything else that was seized, we saw a lot more stuff, including a black Gucci bag that was found on a dresser. And inside that Gucci bag, there was pills, there was powder, there was substances. And so then we got to see another exhibit photo, this of the drugs that were inside the Gucci bag, as well as some eye drops. And I'll talk about these eye drops more in just a second. But inside this Gucci bag was a $100 bill that was rolled up. Again, I kind of referenced back to Dr. Seuss, where it's red fish, blue fish, all that stuff. And it was the same. It was orange pills, yellow pills, white pills, pink pills, black pills, blue pills, literally. Like, those were literally everything that was seized. And then even a crystallized substance as well, too. So inside the Gucci bag, there was some residue that was left over that tested positive for cocaine and ketamine. There was also a black straw in there, a cut-up straw, also tested positive for cocaine and ketamine. Inside the Lumify eye drops bottle, essentially, there was not eye drops in there. Instead, according to this, it was, according to the government and according to Special Agent Gannon, I should say, that this eye drop bottle contained MDMA and ketamine. I was thinking they were just regular eye drops at this point. Then lo and behold, MDMA and ketamine. Then we see a plastic container top with the label DBL wash that tested positive for cocaine. And then during this time period, I jotted down that I'm seeing Diddy taking notes. He's kind of looking at these government displays of just all the exhibit photos that the jury sees, because I think the evidence is very important as far as his reaction to things. Now, when it comes to witness testimony and stuff like that, the cross-examinations for those types of things, you can kind of see where they're going to go. But when it comes to these special agents and the evidence they have when they're collecting and seizing stuff from his properties, I feel like that's kind of hard to explain away. But there's still more stuff, Jesse, that was found, such as a clear Ziploc bag with 9 pills with Supreme label on the side. That tested positive for MDMA. 3 orange pills that were triangular in shape with a Tesla symbol on it. That tested positive for MDMA. We see 6 rectangular tablets. That tested positive for alazepam, which is also essentially Xanax. We see some more Xanax pills. And I will say, Jesse, I feel like the government here kind of does a good job displaying this drug issue as something that's not just isolated with Cassie and the relationship Diddy had with Cassie, but I also think it just kind of bringing it to the present, because we saw these same type of drugs when Diddy's hotel was also when the search warrant for the hotel was done, and we saw these similar type of drugs for that also happened in 2024. Then a few months earlier, when the feds raided his homes, and this home is specifically in Miami, we see that same thing again. So I think the government's doing a good job on just not isolating this to the past, but also kind of bringing it to the present too. But there's more exhibits. We saw the $100 bill that was rolled up tested positive for cocaine and ketamine. We see a blue tablet tested positive for meth and MDMA. We see another blue pill tested positive for MDMA. Once we get into the master bathroom, then we see an exhibit photo of the master bathroom, then a close-up of this wooden box which had the label Puffy on top of this box. And inside this box, there were clear pills and crystallized substance in this box. And then we see these capsules that are called Golden Teachers, and these were actually mushroom capsules. That was kind of an interesting tidbit there. Those were displayed in front of the jury. We see a Ziploc bag in this puffy box with a purple solid crystallized material that tested positive for MDMA, ecstasy, as well as Molly. Then we see other parts of the home, including a hallway closet with, you might guess it, everyone, baby oil and Astroglide. And he said that he had seized from this particular closet 25 bottles of baby oil, 31 bottles of Astroglide, and that wasn't even all the baby oil and Astroglide that was found inside the home. Then later on, we're seeing a handgun that was found in a utility closet. It was in a suitcase. It's a .45 caliber. And then Special Agent Gannon displays this .45 caliber gun. Of course, this gun has a zip tie on it, so that way the jury is aware that this can't be fired or nothing dangerous can kind of happen. Then we see magazine ammunition. And even before that, let me take it back to yesterday, Jesse, when we also saw these AR-15s. We saw the upper receivers of these AR-15s. We also saw the lower receivers of these AR-15s as well, too, which included, had rounds and bullets with them. And so the AR-15s are pretty important because we had known for a while that 3 AR-15s were seized from Diddy's properties, and they had scratched off serial numbers on them as well, too. Something what we had seen in court as far as the AR-15s. We kind of saw them put back together again with that zip tie. And so that was everything that Special Agent Gannon, and I say everything, but there was still a lot of stuff, but that was essentially all the big stuff that Special Agent Gannon and Homeland Security seized from Diddy's property. And Jesse, honestly, another big thing that we learned while Special Agent Gannon was testifying today under cross-examination by Tenny Garagos is that the federal government was conducting an investigation since November 17th of 2023. A big date, I think, that kind of stood out to me because it was this day right after Cassie had filed her federal lawsuit against Diddy that we now know to be settled the next day. And that day actually ended up being the day that the Homeland Security investigation had started.
Look, I think it's imperative for a racketeering case, if you're talking about him operating a criminal enterprise, right, and he has the weapons and the drugs and these kind of suspicious items, it helps to feed that narrative. I also think, you know, from a sex trafficking point of view, that he had set up these coerced sexual events, and there's material that was allegedly used for that. All of this at his home is quite important. Now, I know the defense, you know, in cross-examination, they said that Combs wasn't there. There was no evidence that he was holding or using the weapons. They criticized the level of force that was used. But before I wrap things up, because I know you have to head out of there, Elizabeth, the last part I want to talk about is what we expect tomorrow. We are getting word that Kid Cudi, Scott Miscudi, is going to be taking the stand tomorrow?
Yes, we did. So they're going to be finishing up with George Kaplan tomorrow morning once we get back into court. But yes, the next witness on the stand is Scott Mescudi, a.k.a. Kid Cudi. And I assume that it'll kind of be a busy day in the court house, as it always has been since trial has began. But I think a lot of people, especially possibly fans, might show up. You know, it's a Thursday, it might be rainy, but that hasn't stopped people from just wanting to know more about this trial and just see who is coming in and out of that courthouse every single day. But yes, we can definitely expect Kid Cudi to be taking the stand tomorrow, according to the government, but other people as well too, such as Mila Morales, a hotel witness. The government didn't say this particular witness's name. We'll expect to hear from a Josh Croft tomorrow, and then a Tony Abraham. And so not necessarily sure just all of the connections that these next few witnesses have with Diddy beyond just Kid Cudi. But as far as tomorrow goes, it's expected to be another busy day. Those are, what, 5 witnesses on the stand, minus George Kaplan, so 6 witnesses trying to get in and out tomorrow, and that includes the direct and cross-examination, all trying to get all these witnesses to testify before the long Memorial Day weekend. But we expect a busy day. However, the government says that they might end up ending early tomorrow if they can get through all these witnesses. So we'll see. We kind of have a little bet going on amongst, I have a little bet going on with one of the other reporters on whether or not we'll actually get done a little bit early tomorrow, but it's a wait and see, but definitely a busy day tomorrow.
Ambitious. They think they can get done early. But look, I think Kid Cudi's testimony is going to be fascinating because he had apparently this relationship with Cassandra Ventura that Combs allegedly threatened and maybe did blow up his car, goes to arson, one of those predicate crimes, goes to this overall criminal enterprise. And let's not forget, when Cassandra Ventura in 2023 filed her lawsuit against Combs, and the first time she ever made public, first time we ever knew, this allegation that Combs had threatened to blow up Kid Cudi's car, it was his representative who came out either the same day or the next day and said, this is all true. So it'll be very interesting to see what he has to say on the stand. And we know that Elizabeth Millner is going to be there as well. Thank you so much. As always, great reporting. Get home safe, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.